Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Introduction to Java series. In today's episode, we will be focusing on logic. Now, the what we're going to be talking about are if statements and else statements. So, logic is basically just trying to the simplest way to explain it is that you're checking for conditions. If something is true, else if something is false, if what happens in this case, what would you do in this case? And we need logic in programming. Now, whatever programming you do, almost all of it, and I can guarantee you, will require some form of logic. For example, let's take a hypothetical situation. It's the end of the school year and you have your grades in percentile. So let's say you have a 90%, right? What would that reward you? Well, that would give you an A. So we can set categories like if your grade is above a 90, you get an A. Else, if your grade is between an 80 and an 89, you get a B, and so forth. That's what logic is used for, making decisions. And we're going to talk about how you can do this in programming. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the if statement. So what is an if statement? It checks to see if something is true or not, given a condition. So let's suppose we have double, not double, let's do Boolean. Hope it's either, no, it's true. That should be blue. Now, what I've just done here is I've created a Boolean variable. Now, Booleans are very crucial to checking for logic. Now, this variable currently holds true. What this line of code does is if status is equal to true. Now, I remember earlier we talked about the different comparison operators, but we can go ahead and say if status equals true. So this line is basically checking to see if status is true. And if so, it'll print out true over here. So we're going to run it. And it prints out true. It took a bit, but it printed it out. Now, this is the same thing as saying this. Give it a bit. Now, these are the same thing. What this line of code inside the parentheses does is it checks for a condition. So let's suppose we're going to do, I don't know, two integers comparisons, right? Int A equals 1. Int B equals 2. We can also say if A is less than B, print true. See, so this prints true as well. All this does is it evaluates a condition, and then if that condition is true, it'll execute whatever lines of code are inside over here. So let me go ahead and type out all the possible conditions that we can have. So we can have equals to, which is checking to see if two values are equal to each other. We obviously have greater than, and we have less than, and we have greater than or equal to, and we have less than or equal to. And last but not least, we have bang exclamation mark, which checks to see two values are not equal to each other. Now, you can use any of these 6 comparison operators inside the parentheses here. So you can say if A is less than B, if A is less than or equal to B, if A is greater than B, if A is greater than or equal to B, if A is not equal to B. You can do all these and these will be perfectly fine. You're essentially checking to see if any of these are the case. And if it is the case, then you're going to do whatever's inside over here. So that's the if statement. Now, along with the if statement, let's suppose we have the following. Let's see if two numbers are the same, we're going to print same number, right? But what happens if they're not the same? Then let's go ahead and print not same. But how would we do that? We do that with something called an else condition. Else system not same. What this line of code does is that basically, if the if statement evaluates to false, then it's going to execute whatever is inside the else condition. Now, notice that we don't have parentheses in and set another condition over here. This is because that if this is not true, then there are no other conditions to check. We go straight to the last possible condition or the else condition. Now, note one thing. You don't have to have parentheses if your if statement is one line. So for example, if your if statement is just this, then all you can do is just indent it, and then that's perfectly acceptable. But I highly recommend that you put parentheses around it because most of the time you will have multiple lines of code within these parentheses. So let's go ahead and run this. So it's going to print out not same. That's because the two values are not equal to each other. However, if we did this, it'll print out same number, even because we're checking to see if the two numbers are not the same. And we have to change this up, but it should print out same number, and it does. So these are just the basics, very basic logics. Now, let's go ahead and make a grading calculator. So how would we go about doing that? A grading calculator. So let's say that we want to give a student a letter grade based off his or her percentage. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable called percentage. And let's set it equal to 86. Now, we have to first check if it's an A. So if, I don't know, percentage is greater than or equal to 90, we're going to print A. But what will we do if it's less than 90? Well, we can't just say print like C, D, B, or F. There's so many other alternatives, right? So what happens if we do another if statement? If percentage is greater than or equal to 80. B. This should make sense, right? If it's not this, then it's going to execute these lines of code and check to see if the percentage is greater than 80. So I'm going to go ahead and just, copy these down. So just change it to 70, make that the C, change that to 60, make that a D. And then last but not least, if all these don't work, we're just going to print F. So this should work, right? Let's go ahead and run it. It'll take a while. Now, something is wrong. It's printing B, C, and D. That's strange. We said our grade is 86, so it should print B, right? Because it's greater than 80. However, percentage is also greater than 70 and also greater than 60. See the issue we're running into? It's checking every single if statement. All we want to do is just see if we want to go line by line. And the moment we encounter an if statement that satisfies our condition, we want to break out of it and ignore the rest, just like how an else statement would work. So if we do it like this method, we're simply just going to check all the conditions. And that's not what we want to do. We want to check the first condition that makes it true. So we're going to go ahead and say else if to all these lines of code. So what this does is basically it checks to see, okay, first, let's evaluate this case. Does this work? Nope, it doesn't work. Let's move on. Does this work? yes, it works. So we're not going to check the rest of the conditions because we already know that this works. And it's a waste of time, and something bad might happen if we check the rest. So it'll execute this condition, and then it'll break out of this if statement chain. Does that make sense? So if we run this line of code now, or these lines of code, we should just get B. And that's exactly what we get. Perfect. Now, let's go ahead and let's do a exercise. Let's go ahead and do one on coding that. This is a very good website if you want to practice your skills for logics. So let's do cigar party. When squirrels get together for a party, they like to have cigars. A squirrel party is successful with a number of cigars between 40 and 60 inclusive, unless it's a weekend, which there's no upper bound on the number of cigars. Return true if the parties given the values are successful. So our first condition, let's go ahead and just evaluate if it's between 40 and 60. So we want to check if cigars is greater than or equal to 40. But we also want to see if it's less than or equal to 60. How do we do that in one if statement? Well, you can go ahead and use the ampersand operators twice and say cigars is less than or equal to 60. This is a compound operator. And what this does is basically it checks to see that the if statement satisfies both this first condition and this other condition, and the second condition. So if it satisfies both, if both evaluate to true, then it'll go ahead and execute whatever's inside over here. So let's go ahead and say return true. Now we're not done because we're also given the fact that if it's a weekend, then there is no upper bound. So what we have to do is we have to chain the if statement. So we first have to check to see if it's the weekend. If is weekend equals true, then we have to execute this if statement. That makes sense? So then we execute, oops, my bad. Then we execute this if statement. Now let me go ahead and fix this. Now suppose that the number of cigars is less than 40. What will we do then? Okay, if it is the weekend, then okay, let's make this false. Because okay, if it's not the weekend and the number of cigars in this condition is not true, then we have to say else return false. Hope this makes sense. Now, what will we do if it is the weekend? Then we have to say else, and then we have to check if the number of cigars is just greater than 40. And if it's not, then we say else return false. And this works. So this is what we call compound if statements. Basically, we're checking to see if it's not the weekend. Then we have to see, okay, well, does this condition work? And then we see if it returns true or not. Else, it'll return false. And if cigar is greater than or equal to 40, it'll return true, else return false. Now, there's one more thing you have to know when it comes to logic. There is and there is or. So let's suppose we want to check if it's less than or equal to 40 or if it's greater than or equal to 40. Instead of saying and, the or sign are these two symbols over here. This will mean or. So this is checking to see if cigars is less than or equal to 40 or greater than or equal to 60. Obviously, you can go ahead and do more logic exercises, but these are the gist of if statements. You have if statements, else if statements, and else statements. And you can compound the if statements, and you also have these signs over here, and or, and they will check for multiple conditions. I hope you learned something in today's video, and please let me know if you have any feedback. And take care as always, and I'll see you in the next one. And goodbye.